Hi everyone, welcome. Thank you so kindly for joining us. Welcome to Green Apple Books on the Park. My name is Car Johnson. I'm the event coordinator for Green Apple, and tonight I am very happy to welcome Vauhini Vara for the release of her book, Searches, Selfhood in the Digital Age. Let's give a hand for her. She is joined tonight by Dr. Hanna. Let's give a hand for Alex. I'm very excited to have you two joining us this evening, and I'm very excited to have a full house this evening. I anticipate that you are all excited too, and I can feel it. It's palpable. So thank you for being here with us tonight. Thank you for joining us in person and online. Hello, online audience. I'm waving through a camera. You can't see. We are broadcasting from San Francisco. We open each of our events with a land acknowledgement, and so I would like to let you know that we are operating on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land. We think that acknowledgement requires action, and so we encourage you to donate either your time or monetary means to an Indigenous organization each time you hear a land acknowledgement. We have details about the Ramaytush Ohlone Land Trust at the back desk if you are interested in how to participate in this project of rematriation. Very brief business before I let these two take over. Now's a good time to silence your cell phones if you have not already. I didn't ask about picture taking. How do we feel about photo taking? Okay, indifferent, negative?
Yeah.
It's okay. It's okay. Just no bad pictures. No bad pictures are allowed.
Just look great.
Yes, exactly. I mention all this to say don't take a phone call in the middle of the event. So thank you. Please do check out our full event calendar online at greenapplebooks.com. We have a really great season ahead of us, including the event that you are currently attending. I'll give a very brief plug now that next Saturday, April 26th, is Independent Bookstore Day. It's our biggest day of the year. We are sure to have free books. Please come and grab some of those. We are going to have mimosas. We are also going to have coffee, and we are going to have some tarot. I'm just thinking off the top of my head, going through our schedule. We're going to have tarot readings and crystals and plenty of other stuff, including a happy hour with authors Daniel Handler and Colin Winnett, who happens to be here. The happy hour all goes to support Books Not Bans, which is a San Francisco-based organization that sends queer books by queer people to those most affected by book bans. So thank you for letting me do that little plug. I'll see you here next Saturday. Let's see. Please do buy books if you are able. If you've been here before, you've certainly heard me say that when you buy books from us, not only do you support us as an independent bookstore, you support the writers who put so much work into making these books, and then you get to have a book, which might be the best part. So if you are able, we always appreciate it. Thank you so much. Without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce the two writers who are joining us tonight. First, Dr. Hanna is Director of Research at the Distributed AI Research Institute and a lecturer in the School of Information at University of California, Berkeley. She is an outspoken critic of the tech industry, a proponent of community-based uses of technology, and a highly sought-after speaker and expert. Her book, co-authored by Emily M. Bender, The AI Con, How to Fight Big Tech's Hype and Create the Future We Want, is out next month. So you can pre-order that tonight. It's May 13th? May 13th?
May 13th.
May 13th. It's out in 1 month. So we'll see you then when you pick up your copy of the book. Let's give one more warm welcome to Dr. Hanna. And last but most certainly not least, Vauhini Vara has been a reporter and editor for The Atlantic, The New Yorker, and New York Times Magazine, and is the prize-winning author of The Immortal King Rao and This Is Salvaged. She is joining us from Fort Collins, Colorado. Searches is her nonfiction debut, and the reason we are here tonight. Let's give one more hand for Vauhini Vara.
Hello.
Hi.
How you doing?
Good. Thanks for joining me. I'm super excited.
I'm very excited too. How's it feel being back in the Bay?
It feels so mixed. But I was at my neighborhood bookstore. Used to be Dog-Eared Books.
Oh yeah,
in the Mission.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that's the Dog-Eared.
And I was there this afternoon, and the bookseller was somebody who worked there 20 years ago when I lived in the neighborhood, and I was just thinking about how my friends and I would go look at some of whom are here would like go look through the shelves of dog-eared and be like, maybe one day we'll get the right books that'll be on these shelves, and now here we are. I mean, not just me, but those friends of mine too. And then at the same time, I was like feeling very wistful and nostalgic for that time. I was like, I bet that version of me would not have guessed that the later version who wrote the books would be like, I wish it was the year 2004.
Anyway. Us in 2004 didn't know what was awaiting us here in 20 years later. That ties in really nicely to my question because it's about this book and what it does. I mean, of course, this is a very unconventional book, and it plays a lot with form and style, and you impose these periodizations of your own life against like these sets of technologies. So AOL, Amazon, Google, Facebook, and OpenAI. And I think we're about the same age, kind of how it's described.
I'm 41.
Yeah, I'm 39. So it's like, so then it would be, I would have put MySpace in there. MySpace is so influential, and it's kind of shocking to feel as though we've grown up with these big technological shifts, and there's like a frog boiling kind of feeling in this, but these shifts have been pretty monumental. So I want to ask this, like, how did you get the idea to structure this as a memoir, which ran parallel to these big news and technology?
So the book started with this chapter that was then an essay made up of my own Google searches over a 10-year period. So I didn't know at that time that this was like going to evolve into a book. But what happened was, I had covered Google as a reporter. So I knew that Google defaulted to tracking all kinds of personal information about us, and that if there were certain things that you didn't want it to track, you had to kind of proactively turn that off, right? And then there were certain things that you couldn't turn off. I was very aware of this. I was aware of it while covering Google and companies like it for years and years and years. But it was only in 2019 that I thought to myself, wait, so have I done that? Like, and I went and looked, and it turned out there had been these periods off and on when I turned it off, but then I guess turned it back on at some point. And so it turned out Google had been tracking all my Google searches since the year 2005, when it started doing this, sort of defaulting to this tracking. What interested me about that at that time was this question that occurred to me, having to do with like whether it might be possible to reappropriate all that Google now owned about everything that I'd done since the year 2005 for my own purposes, and kind of like redefine that on my own terms, like my own artistic terms, my own personal terms, sort of like define the value of all that I'd been searching for the way I wanted to define it. So I made this essay made up of like a subset of my Google searches over 10 years, from 2010 to 2019. And when I finished writing that essay, I still didn't know whether I had somehow successfully reappropriated all this material for myself on my own terms, right? Or whether I had actually just, number one, done nothing, right? Like Google still benefited from all this information it had about me. And potentially, number two, like propagandized on Google's behalf by publishing this essay saying like, look how lovely this collection of my Google searches that Google is collecting is, right? And it felt uncomfortable. There was like shame associated with it, a feeling of complicity. And so, I don't know, being a journalist interested in the truth and transparency, being a creative writer interested in like self-revelation on some level, and also like leaning into things that are like shameful and that are related to kind of complicity in bigger systems of oppression and exploitation. I found myself interested in seeing like whether there was a whole book to write about that feeling by enacting the same thing on the level of a book-length project.
Yeah, no, I love this, and thinking about leaning into the shame, right? I'm thinking, and there's a few, I want to touch on both the complicity and the use of tools. Like I have questions specifically about that. But let's talk about the title searches and the title of chapter 1, which is Your Whole Life Will Be Searchable. And search as a technology. I should also say I used to work at Google, so there's that. That's not in my bio because it sucked, but like, um, um, so search as a technology was hugely disruptive. We moved from the web and this like Lycos style lists, to search. And I don't know if you've seen the show *Halt and Catch Fire*. Like they have a whole like subplot where they go from this Lycos style ontologization and then they're gesturing to search, and it's about these shifts in technology. It's kind of like a history of computation. Wrote a drama. I love it, but like, what do you think this has done just to how we search information? I mean, I think this is like the ethos of Google, which is, this haughty kind of thing, organizing the world's information to be useful, which is just a wild thing to say. But then I also would love for you to also say, like, and what does that mean for this quote from Larry Page, which you quote in the book, which is your whole life will be searchable, where the title of the chapter, what does that signify for kind of our own memory and our own archive?
Yeah, I mean, I think, okay, so to back up for a second, I think, and I'm curious about your thoughts on this, because I bet like you have a position on this that is embedded in the question, and I want to hear that. I think oftentimes when we talk about technology companies' products, we, the users of these products, will say, we are being exploited, full stop. We have little choice in using these products because we are living in a world in which these products are so pervasive. These companies have used underhanded techniques to gain monopoly power, and that's one of the reasons we feel we have to use their products, right? And then the companies will say, not entirely unreasonably, I'm sort of arguing implicitly in the book, hey, listen, you're using these products because you want to use them on one level, right? We're providing you with something that you want. And so for me, like on a conceptual level, the idea of searching is something that feels really fundamental to like who we are as people, right? Like our species, for better or worse, often worse, is really interested in like, it is a really curious species. And that curiosity is often bound up in like domination and exploitation, but then also like can be exploited and dominated, right? And so, starting when I was in middle school and those early search engines those early search products started to be available, I was going to the internet with questions that I had that felt too embarrassing or vulnerable or scary to ask to people in my real life, like often about like my body image, like things I was embarrassed about myself, right? And then later my sister got sick and was diagnosed with a rare kind of cancer. I wanted to know what her prognosis was. I didn't want to ask an actual human being, so I was like searching in Yahoo to find out what her prognosis was. Eventually that evolved into Google's technologically different approach to search. And I think, like a lot of times the word tool is used to describe what these companies offer. And I think like rhetorically that positions these things as things that are like primarily meant to be useful to us, right? Like the assumption, the kind of implicit embedded assumption is if we go to, Yahoo then, Google now, with our questions, like we are going to get the best possible answer. And there's going to be a kind of like objectivity to that answer. In reality, because Google is a corporation and it has investors, its ultimate goal is to make money for itself and its investors. I mean, it's just, one can attach a value judgment to that. Whatever value judgment one attaches to it is just a fact. And so its goal isn't necessarily to be particularly useful to us, although usefulness is somehow related to what it does. And so, it turns out that in using these products, like I am getting some of what I signed up for. The promise that these companies are making, that Google is making, is like being met to some extent, but not entirely the way the company is promising.
Right. And I guess thinking about it in personal, I mean, we're searching these things close to us. I mean, it's interesting because it's sort of like we have I'm going to make an awful information security admission here, but I don't delete my email. And I know, sorry, which is very bad practice. You should delete your email. Like after 1 year, this is why companies have these policies. But it's also become, to me, kind of an archive, not of the searches, but an archive of what's happened for the past 20 years since I've had email, right? And so I guess insofar as thinking about that, like when we're thinking about search and indexing kind of our own lives, how do you think search has changed that?
Yeah, I mean, probably like the most complete archive of my concerns since the year 2005 that exists is Google's archive of all the things that I've searched for. And in fact, I never did change that toggle switch to say, hey, Google, don't track my searches, because as a writer, as a human too, but like also because I make a living as a writer and as a journalist, like I think of that as like a potentially useful archive that I would like to go back to, and that's going to serve me well, right? And so this is like another example of one of those ways in which like it would be easy but disingenuous for me to say like Google's exploiting me, because I'm here making an active choice to maintain this archive because I do want the archive.
No, 100%. Let me look at my next question. I want to talk about this move that you've done from tech reporting to literature, and also now back to nonfiction. And you say in the book, the kind of writing I wanted to pursue in graduate school felt different. It felt connected to humans' tangible sensate existence, rather than the systems and machines built to control it. And I really like this because I majored in computer science and sociology, and I tell people, well, I majored into sociology because I thought people were more interesting than computers. But in writing a book ostensibly about technology, what are the kinds of moves and choices to ensure the text remains quote sensate?
Yeah, I mean, so when I realized this was a book, I realized that I wanted to write a book about, in some ways, more about power than about technology, right? I mean, I think sometimes when there are conversations about technology, the way it's framed is like the technological versus the human. And what I'm more interested in is the hegemonic, right? Like the form of power that reinforces existing structures of wealth and power versus other kinds of power, individual and collective power that we can have as individuals, right? But then also the way in which those are intertwined, and like we as individuals can be complicit in hegemonic power, right? So this sounds totally unrelated to what we're talking about here, but I feel I'm interested in this book and the way in which like communication is like the medium is one of the important media through which like those power dynamics are negotiated. So my point being that like online, the what we're using to communicate online tends to be like language, image, video, music to an extent, but like all the things that we also use to communicate with one another, and that were like originally invented in order for us to communicate with one another. And what that means is that because the internet is dominated by big technology companies, like we are kind of like necessarily complicit in the rising dominance of these companies and their exploitation of us, because every time we make a search on Google, every time we write a review on Amazon, every time we converse with ChatGPT, which I'm sure we'll talk about at some point, we are contributing, we're benefiting somewhat, but we're contributing to like the vast benefit that these companies get, right? And so it felt like language and the way in which we use language like had to be, and whether it's like written language or visual language, like had to be in some ways the subject of the book. And so then So the way the book is organized is that there are these sort of like, sort of narrative chapters, like somewhat more conventional chapters where I'm just writing about my own life through the internet and big technology companies' products from like the mid-90s to today, both as a individual just living in the world and also as a journalist covering these companies. But then every other chapter is in the form of my use of one of these companies' products. So like there's a chapter made up of my Google searches. There's a chapter made up of my actual Amazon reviews at a time when I was trying not to use Amazon much. There's a chapter made up in part of images that I generated using image generation AI. And so what I thought I could try to do here was see if there was a way to like just enact the thing that's happening to all of us by making myself the sort of like central character, in part because like I want to talk about the complicity that we all have, that discomfort, but I think like I need to, in order to like have a character for, you know, narratively speaking, for people to like have something to grab onto, there has to be someone that's pulling them through the story. And I felt like in part ethically speaking, you know, I wasn't interested in like choosing someone else and being like, look how horrible this person is for using all these products. It felt like the right move was to be like, look, I'm one of these people, which is like so icky. It like feels very uncomfortable and bad. But it felt like the way to approach it.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be particularly fair to be like, look at Alex Hanna, look at how she uses this. What a schlub.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you need to center it. But I do want to, I want to pull at this, right? And so this is the thing that like, so you intersperse the chapters you've written with this conversation with ChatGPT, you know, and I've sort of told you, you know, like I really don't like it. I really dislike this. Because the ChatGPT text is like very kind of anodyne and tedious and business oriented, and you know there's sort of a bullet point ness to it, you know, and then I think one of the prompts you offer, you're like, don't write this in bullet points. Like I'm so done with bullet points, right? But I want to have this discussion about this device, right? I mean, because I think it's an important discussion, and because it is such a central tension in the book, right?
Yeah.
And if we're using and how using the tools helps the reader engage with the tools, and whether it's sort of like not, I don't think, passing a value judgment on using it, because as you noted, you're establishing there's a sort of complicity that we have. But then this is, of course, in tension, which you highlight with one of the later chapters, which is called, you know, the Master's Tools, right? You know, the famous lecture by Audre Lorde. So I want to talk a little bit about like this tension a little bit, especially because we're at this sort of moment where Amazon is a bit hegemonic, Google's a bit hegemonic.
Yeah.
OpenAI is maybe not as hegemonic in this whole, you know, like we might be in this place where, you know, we are, you know, can push back. And how do you balance that tension of highlighting these kinds of things that these tools do and kind of making yourself the central character and carrying weight for the companies?
I know. You know, Alex and I, by the way, don't really oftentimes, like when I or any of us do events, like we invite a friend of ours, right, to come on stage and like be asked like really friendly questions that make us feel good. Alex and I don't really know each other, but I have admired Alex and been interested in Alex's work for a long time. And part of the reason I was really interested in having you talk to me about this book, Alex, is that I imagined you would probably come into a conversation with like a strong point of view on these questions, right?
I mean, thank you for making yourself open to that.
I'm terrified.
No. You're braver than I am. And authors. There's a joke that Kieran Healy made on Twitter ages ago, which is, you know, it's not usually author meets critics. It's author meets friends, or author meets friends who haven't written their books yet, or something like that. You know, so thank you for making an actual author meets critics type session.
No, and I'm very willing to engage on this. I mean, you know, it's a really tricky open question, and one that honestly, like, I've been asking myself more since the book came out last Tuesday. So I described the structure of the book, and a part that I hadn't explicitly described, which Alex set up, is when you open the book and start reading, the book opens with this conversation with ChatGPT, where the kind of, I'm going to call it the me character, the I character says to ChatGPT, hey, listen, I'm writing this book. I want to share it with you and hear your thoughts. Can I share it with you? ChatGPT says, like, of course, I'm here to help. Please share it. And so I give ChatGPT 2 chapters at a time of my book. So you read that first interaction, you get 2 chapters of the book, and then we come back into the ChatGPT conversation. Something that I intentionally do is I make it sound to ChatGPT as if I'm writing a book sort of in conversation with it, right? Like I'm actually asking for its feedback. I didn't actually want to do that. I didn't want my work to be like influenced by ChatGPT's conversation about it, right? So to be clear, I wrote the book first and then I engaged with ChatGPT as if I were asking it for feedback. I was interested with all of these products, I'm kind of interested in like the promise they're making to us and the gap between that and like the reason they provide these products, right? With any of these entities. And so with ChatGPT as a product, what ChatGPT promises to us is that it's going to like be good at following instructions. Like that's what OpenAI says ChatGPT is supposed to be good at, right? So like basically being good at like being bossed around. You could even say like at being manipulated by our goals, right? And so part of, for me, like the game or performance of my interaction with ChatGPT in the book was this question of like, can I manipulate this conversation to have it show the things I'm interested in showing about ChatGPT? At the same time, what I was very clear about even going into this is that OpenAI has its own goals with ChatGPT, a product. And I imagine, I don't know, the company, OpenAI, hasn't said this explicitly, but I would imagine that any company that has an AI chatbot like this has as one of its goals to shape our perceptions and in turn our behavior. Another word for that is manipulation, right? To manipulate us. Yeah. And so I was really interested in like what it would look like to enact this sort of like attempt at manipulation on my part versus the attempt at manipulation on ChatGPT's part and have that happen on the page. Now, the question which you raise is, so does that end up being entirely a critique of ChatGPT and therefore OpenAI? Does it actually end up being entirely propaganda for ChatGPT and therefore OpenAI? And then there's this other question of like, is it both, right? Yeah. I think I felt very strongly in writing the book and publishing the book that it was like much closer to the critique camp than the propaganda camp. Yeah. And I felt that critique was like bound up in complicity, but I felt very strongly about that. Something that has rattled me since the book has come out that I think is like worth talking about because I think it's interesting, and I'd love your thoughts on this, is that when I Google myself in the name of my book, which I obviously do daily, multiple times a day, to see...
So do I. If people say they don't Google themselves, they are lying.
When I've done that, I have noticed that many of the headlines on articles about or reviews of my book have titles like, to write her book, Vauhini Vara turned to ChatGPT for help, right? Like those kinds of things. A lot of the titles have the word ChatGPT and words like collaboration, which I think are very loaded, right? Or aid or help. Yeah. And so to the extent that I was really interested in writing a book that would contain a critique that I felt really passionate about, and I knew that not everybody, way more people were going to read about the book than read the book, I thought writing this book would be a really interesting way to like get a message into the world, not just through the pages of the book, but through the way in which people were writing about the book.
Yeah.
The fact that most of the writing about the book has taken this other shape that to me reads as supportive maybe of the goals of these companies has been really, 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 really uncomfortable for me, and has sort of like shaken me.
Yeah.
And I'm just saying that out loud because in some ways, like objectively speaking, it makes it more interesting. Like it's not fun, but like it makes for a more interesting conversation. I'm interested in your thoughts on this too.
I mean, yeah, I have big feelings on this, but it's also your event. You read my book next month.
Yes, the AI Con by Dr. Alex Hanna and Emily M. Bender.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're interested in my thought on that, we'll talk about it later. But it is related to my second question, which is this idea of complicity, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it is. And I saw a play. There was a play that I advised on that ACT put on a few months ago called Big Data.
Okay.
And the kind of premise of the play was like, people, it's all about kind of various elements of technological capture.
Mm-hmm.
And the play ends in a way that's kind of, I think, can be read in two ways. One in which, like I won't say what it is because you can still see it, but like one in which there's an attempted like exit, but then kind of the omnipresent person played by B.D. Wong is like kind of stands for the algorithm and is like, he's like, did you actually miss me? And so like there's no exit. So I guess the question is like about this kind of complicity with Amazon, with Google, and I think there's no easy answer here, right? Yeah. I mean, but how do you feel the reader can really navigate this kind of unease of complicity and convenience?
So many thoughts. I'm so glad you asked that question. No, I mean, I was interested in this question of complicity, not just to say like, oh, this feels uncomfortable, huh? Too bad. Like, this is the world we live in, right? I was interested in it because it recognizes the role of our own agency as individuals and communities in the rising dominance of these companies. So if it's the case that these companies dominate and exploit us and the planet because we have no choice, right? Like there's this machine they've created that is now set up. It can't be any different. It would then follow that like we're just on this path and it's going to continue forever, right? Yeah. And the companies, by the way, are engaged in like this really active campaign to describe a future in which this is inevitable, right? So the CEOs of these companies will write blog posts, they'll post on social media saying things like, AI, and I'm sure people here have heard this, like AI is the future, like you got to just get on board. There's nothing to be done about it, right? AI is the future. And like AI, okay, fine. I think AI is like the kind of avatar for really saying like increased big technology company dominance is the future. Like, and we'll call it AI. That's the most recent manifestation. So they write these blog posts, they post it on social media, they have a lot of followers. And so then other people reproduce that on social media. They have a lot of influence in Congress. And so they go to Congress and they talk to Congress people. And then people like Chuck Schumer and others, not to, all these people will go and make speeches and say AI is the future. Yeah. And so it then creates a narrative in which it feels as if everyone's saying that and therefore this must be the future. Yeah. And again, I don't think of it as an AI future. I think of it as like an even more big tech dominated, big corporate dominated future. If it's the case that we have agency, if it's the case that we are currently complicit, it would then follow that we have agency. We can like make other choices. And if that's true, we can ask ourselves, well, if there are things these companies are providing that we find useful, are there ways in which we could like build that usefulness into technology or other things on our own, using models different from their model, right? And some examples of that already exist in the world are government-funded models, including local government-funded models, foundation-funded models, right? Like models funded, like models funded by foundations.
You talk about Mozilla and Firefox and the
Wikipedia, exactly. Yeah. So these exist in the world already. Worker-owned models, right? There are all kinds of ways that you could say, hey, let's get together and build the technologies that do the thing we want them to do and have it not bound up in this model. And so if that's the case, then like maybe we can imagine actual different futures we want and work toward those. So that's the idea that I have in mind.
Yeah. So thinking about that, just to reiterate, like thinking about our own complicity means that, I mean, it's individual action is probably not enough. I mean, individual opt-out is we need institutions to actually offer different alternatives, right? Oh crap, we got like 4 minutes left. So I want to talk. Okay, what do I want to do in 4 minutes? I want to talk about the image chapter. So you, in the chapter on images, you invoke Sadia Hartman and her notion of critical fabulation. So this is a method which she says, quotes, trouble the line between history and imagination. And Hartman engages in fabulation to discuss the violence of the archive, lives left unremarked upon in the colonial archive and records of the transatlantic slave trade. In some ways, I guess the tension here is that those imaginations could never happen, right? They, right? Those, and to be included, I think the kind of way you can talk about this is like showing these images that have like, are super, super biased, like, and there's other studies by Bloomberg that have shown this. On the other hand, like to get represented in those data sets, you have to make that devil's bargain, right? This is something Keanu Yao and Taylor has called predatory inclusion, like in housing. So I guess the tension I want to hold is, and maybe this is an easy answer, or maybe there's a larger conversation, is, I mean, those can these tools, image generation tools, like ever really represent us?
The simple answer is no. That's the answer I'd like to give. Can I give some more context about like how?
Sorry, I went into this specific.
I'm so glad you did. I mean, so there's a chapter in the book. There are these kind of two paired chapters. There's one chapter where I talk about kind of like the history of how we as human beings have used images as a form of communication, right? Like as a form of culture, or a manifestation of culture since the beginning of time, starting with, cave paintings and etchings. And now there are these companies that say to us, listen, like, we can help you generate images to represent things that like you really want to see, but where those images don't exist, right? So there's this organization in Spain that, with funding from Google and other entities, is saying, like, we're going to collect stories about times in people's lives or in Spanish history or other countries, sort of contested and histories in which, like, things happened that you remember as an individual, but that there aren't images of because, like, the archive was dominated by those in power during that time, and that wasn't you and your family, right? And they're using AI to generate these images. The question that raises is like, is that actually something is that a promise that can actually be met, right? And if that promise is not being met, whose goals are actually being served by the generation of those images? And so I wrote this chapter that's like in the form of a pitch to investors, where I say the I character because there are a lot of like different disguises, I guess I could say, that I'm wearing, or different forms that I'm taking in the book. But the I character is making a pitch to investors. I'm saying, hey, I'm here in front of you because I want your money to start a company. I am going to build a spaceship that is going to travel to outer space, to another dimension, another universe similar to ours, where all of the lost objects of our lives, girls' and women's lives from this world, are being kept and archived, like in a kind of museum. So I'm telling these investors that I want their money, but then I say like, but I know investors like an origin story, so I'm going to tell you my origin story. And then I use my own family story on my mom's side, my own factually true, actual family story, to generate images for this pitch, that are going to like go along with my verbal pitch. Because when my mom was growing up, like they didn't have cameras, right? So like she's a huge storyteller. I probably learned to be a writer and a storyteller through my mom's like oral storytelling. And she's told me all these stories, but there's no imagery that actually exists that can be attached to it. So the challenge there obviously is like, to what extent are these products going to generate images that actually represent things that are like what happened in my mom's life and later in my life that I don't have pictures of? And like, I don't think it's a spoiler to say that gap is like kind of comically enormous, right? There's this one image, for example, where I'm describing this vessel holding all the girls' and women's objects. And the image that's generated is like, you know, like this big kind of like crystalline jar that has all these like vanity, like ladies products, like lipsticks and combs and stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, I think like that obviously is, it's an enactment of what I think the gap is. If like Sam Altman were here, he might say something like, yeah, but the technology just isn't advanced enough. We will eventually get there. Number one, who knows whether on a technical level they'll eventually get there. But number two, I would make the argument that like fundamentally, like it's like definitionally impossible for a big technology company's image generation model that is designed to make that company money to somehow actually fulfill my emotional needs that are fact-based. Sorry, that was really long. I probably was like a more than 4-minute answer.
Do we have time for one more? Okay. I think to end on, I think, a more like hopeful or kind of speculative note, the last chapter is this chapter in which you prompt people for these kind of a collective knowledge or for collective imagination. And I love this quote that Ruha Benjamin makes in her book Imagination, in which she says, you know, imagination is a collective resource, right? You know, we're not here for, you know, like these individual, you know, like celebrities. You know, we need to collectively imagine. And so, yeah, I'd love to kind of think about like that last chapter and sitting with that last chapter and thinking about how we here could kind of think about a collective technological imaginary.
Yeah, no, thanks for that question. I mean, I was thinking too about Audre Lorde's writing about guilt, right? Audre Lorde writes, I'm paraphrasing here, I don't remember the exact line, but Audre Lorde says something like, listen, fine, there's guilt, but I don't have a lot of patience for guilt or shame on its own. Like, and I think she uses the word useful. Like, she was like, guilt can be generative if we use it to then get somewhere else, right? Yeah. Like, if we feel badly about our complicity in something now, where can we go from there? To the extent that in some ways, like, I'm positioned as a villain, maybe I could say, if that's not too strong, in the book, because of my complicity, we get to the end of like my arc of the book and I don't become a hero, right? Like, we get to the end and I acknowledge that like I still am using these products. So it then occurs to me, like in the context of the book, it occurs to the me character that like I'm not, obviously not enough, right? Like I myself, my own individual agency is like not doing the job here. I need help, right? And so in the last chapter, what I did was, and some of you might be familiar with this or even filled it out, I created this like Google form survey where I asked questions about like people's lives and their histories and what the world around them, their values, their hopes, and like what they imagine the future might look like, what the role of technology, however they define technology, might be in that. Honestly, like, I mean, this is an overstatement, but like rhetorically, I guess I can say, or literarily as like a kind of call for help, right? Like this character's gotten to the end of her journey. She has, in a rhetorical sense, failed, right? Like if I'm Frodo, like that ring is like bad things are happening with that ring. I cannot.
Well, I don't know if you put the ring on.
Yeah, maybe I put the ring. Maybe I've been carrying the ring around.
I think if putting the ring on means you go work at OpenAI.
Yeah, okay. Maybe I haven't put the ring on.
Yeah.
But I'm sort of standing there hovering at the edge.
Yeah,
you know?
you're like
I'm like,
yeah. Yeah.
And so I need my best friend Samwise. I need like my collective Samwise energy all around to like, I want like everybody to like come charging onto that. I'm imagining the movie version right now. Sure. Like onto that, like whatever that is, that's jutting out over the, what's it called? The lake of fire.
My Lord of the Rings knowledge is so bad. I know there's a ring.
We're over Mordor?
Mount Doom.
Mount Doom.
Thank you.
We're right there. We're like over all this lava, and I'm sitting there like I'm doing this, and like I want all these people to surge in, and like collectively we grab the ring and we throw it in. And so in this last chapter, what it is you read the questions and then you read a kind of compilation of the answers. And I find it, I mean, what it also is, it's that on one level, it's also for me like an argument for like expanding our definition of like what's important about language. Because sometimes as writers, we're like, these AI companies are training on our books. As writers, they're copyrighted. They should get our consent. We should be compensated. We should get credit, right? But I think in some ways like that is still buying into like this capitalist construct about like what makes our words valuable. I'm interested in saying like, listen, all of our communication is valuable on our own terms. Like, like maybe somebody who like just like wrote a review on Amazon whose work is being used to train AI models, like doesn't technically, that's not copyrighted, so they can't go and sue the companies, but like maybe they have as much right as I do, right? And so if I'm celebrating like human communication through text and images, period, then like having this chapter made up of like real people's texts like felt like an important statement.
Yeah, absolutely. This is fantastic. Let's give Vauhini a hand. And let's open it up for Q&A to our collective Samwise. Should folks come and use the microphone or?
You can just speak loud.
Okay.
And we can like repeat your questions. Ask whatever you want. Feel free to ask Alex questions because we have her expertise here.
Oh no.
Yeah.
Yeah, why are people backing AI when it's going to destroy so many jobs and it uses some form of energy, and that people are crazy enough to think that nuclear energy is actually a good source to use for that?
So the person asking the question is pointing out that, and I'm glad you raised this because it hasn't come up in this conversation, like some of the many things that are problematic and toxic about the activities of AI companies, one of which is that there's a huge energy and water cost far beyond like sort of like the equivalent activity when you're doing a Google search, for example. And so the question is like, why are people backing this in the first place? I'm glad you asked the question. I mean, I think one reason people are backing it is that there are a lot of monetary resources going into investing in these companies, including investing in the messaging required to spread the idea that these are useful tools for us, right? Things we can collaborate with, things that are going to help serve our purposes. That said, you know, the whole interest of my book is to say people are also using these products because apparently we find them useful to an extent. And I think that's what we have to sit with, because the question then becomes like, well, so then what? Like, do we decide, yes, these products are useful to us to an extent, maybe, if that's what we feel, and yet the cost is so high that we're going to decide not to use that. I mean, we do that all the time, you know, like people choose not to eat meat, even if maybe they like the taste, right? Like it's a little bit delicious to them, but they feel that the cost is too high. There are all kinds of ethical decisions we make. Even when we feel there's like some gain from doing a thing, we decide not to do the thing. The other way that we could take that question, though, is to say like, well, if there's some way in which this is useful, is there a way, maybe now, maybe in the future, to like pursue technologies like this that might give us the useful part and be disentangled from the harmful parts? I think that's still an open question, though. I don't know, like maybe it's possible, maybe it's not, but I think it's worth thinking about.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear, we've been talking about this continuum from critic to propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And when you were writing these essays, were you thinking from the onset, this is the line I want to hold with this essay, and then writing to that, or were you holding separate questions and then figured out sort of where you stood on that spectrum afterwards?
So with each essay, my starting point was, what is the company behind this product promising? Like, what is it? What is the promise that's supposed to be drawing me to it? Where can I situate myself within that promise? Right? Like, so to give an example, I wrote this essay called Ghosts, using GPT-3, which was a predecessor to the models underlying ChatGPT. It was about the death of my sister and my grief over it, and I was like I was using this model to generate text. The model, like, with this sort of idea that the promise that was being made was that this model could like help me express something that I couldn't otherwise express, right? For me, so knowing that that's what the model promised, I was like, well, what's the one thing that's like hardest for me to talk about? And it was the death of my sister and my grief over it. And so that is like sort of like where I situated my engagement with the product. And so the experiment or game or challenge, whatever you want to call it, with each of these products was like how far can I lean into that dynamic? To what extent will that expose the gap between the promise and the thing that what this product is actually doing? And then also, like, to what extent is the game or challenge or experiment another form of complicity, you know? So, you know, the book is called Searches in part because, like, I'm really leaning into the questions here. Like, I don't come to the end of the book saying, like, and here is my definitive answer about, like, whether this was entirely critique or entirely propaganda, or, like, here's the exact percentage of each that it was.
Yeah, the backpack, I saw that.
Yeah, I was just wondering, as a writer, you know, if you had experiences where language models do help you express yourself better. Let's say you've got an idea that you throw in, and what you get back is a clearer articulation of that idea. It's something I struggle with PhD students. I've had this experience, and you know, Jan Wickham says that he thinks, oh, will just be, at the end of the day, be good writing assistants. And I kind of found it to be that. You know, it's not giving me ideas, or my ideas, but it helps me articulate them more clearly. And, you know, I was wondering if you had that experience, and if so, like, what do you do with that?
Yeah. So the person who was asking the question was saying, was raising the possibility that engaging with a large language model, a technology like the ones behind ChatGPT or Gemini or whatever, might help you express yourself better. And the question was, has that happened with you? I'm going to answer that question in two parts. I mentioned that essay Ghosts, in which I was engaging with GPT-3 to write about the death of my sister and my grief. Without telling the whole story of the essay, what eventually happened was that it became clear over my use of this product that, as interesting as the text might be that this product was generating, as moving to me as a reader it might even be, it sort of like definitionally and functionally was not capable of representing my perspective, right? And so ultimately I was the only one who could do that. So I can say that in my case, for me, I have never had the experience of having, I've played around in other ways. I've never had the experience of having one of these models help me clarify my own feelings. I did want to mention there was this study out of Cornell. So for me, one thing that happened was that as this model sort of like generated text representing falsehoods, like that didn't represent my experience, I felt compelled to delete that and sort of in response or in opposition be more explicit about my experience, right? So there's one sense in which the falsehoods that were being generated were then compelling truths out of me. That said, there's some research out of Cornell a couple of years ago where the researchers asked people to write essays about social media. And there was a control group, and that control group was just asked to like write essays about social media. And then there were two test experiment groups. One of the experiment groups was asked to write essays about social media with the help of a tool that had been fine-tuned, that had been sort of like additionally trained to produce text representing negative opinions about social media. And then another experiment group was asked to use a model that was trained to express, what did I say? I said negative before? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so trained to produce language that suggested positive opinions about social media. And what they found was that people using those models, those AI models, ended up being twice as likely to write essays aligned with the quote unquote views of those models, which is interesting and noteworthy in like an abstract sense, but it becomes more interesting and noteworthy when we remember that there are like really a small handful of big technology dominated AI platforms that are typically used. And on the one hand, like these are machines, they don't have personalities, they don't have consciousness, they don't have perspective. On the other hand, the companies behind them do, right? They have their values, they have their goals. And so one can imagine a future in which like we all feel like it's kind of benign to go to ChatGPT and say, hey, can you give me feedback on this essay I have to write or this op-ed I'm writing about social media, and that, or let's say this essay that I have to write about AI and its role in our lives, right? And that model that we're using actually is producing text that is biased in favor of AI and biased to generate language that suggests that AI has a very positive role in our lives. That means that if a lot of us are using that, all of a sudden, like there's this noticeable change in the discourse in which more of that is being produced. And then also just on a more fundamental level, again, like that's not us. That's us being told. It's not even like a human versus technology thing for me. It's like really us being told what to write and therefore, in a sense, what to think by big technology companies. Like that's what it comes down to for me. And that's what I think is problematic and scary.
I mean, Jan LeCun is also someone who is the chief AI scientist at Meta, and has said a lot of problematic things about AI. I saw one more question here in the beige hat.
I mean, kind of like jumping off of the previous question about like AI as a brainstorming tool, and often in that brainstorm, it's kind of validating your own ideas back to you in a way that just seems more coherent because you're sorting it out. And it just made me think because you know, people also talk about like AI friends, AI companions, and when you're like chatting with ChatGPT, like ChatGPT could be like very business-like and precise, but there are other AI models that are much more personable. And I'm curious, like you came into this book knowing that you're trying to like manipulate them or like, you know, use this for your own purposes. But did you ever feel a tension where it was kind of like you were companions, or like even though they didn't have personality, it was like this presence, this friend, and yeah, and just your thoughts on these like AI companions that people are talking about too. I'm just it feels like it belongs in this broader territory.
Yeah, so the question, I'm glad you raised that. The question was about like these AI products that are described as like AI companions. There was an article in the New York Times today, I haven't read it yet, about like AI therapists, right? Again, I'm really interested in language and how it's used as a tool, right? Like language as rhetoric, the language being used for a purpose. And I think phrases like AI companion, AI therapist are persuasive phrases that subtly make us think of these products as being like kind of like people, right? I mean, I think the same is true when AI companies use the term collaboration often, right, to talk about our interactions with their products. It's part of the reason it like really I had like a full body reaction when I started to see headlines about my book, right, that use that term collaboration because it was the same language. All of which is to say that I think one thing that's really important to do is to think about like where even these ways of thinking about these products come from, because I think often it originates from the companies. That said, you're pointing out that like a lot of times when people talk about AI chatbots, it'll sort of be like, well, they sound so dumb and bland and corporate, so that's a non-starter, right? And I think it's worth pointing out that like these technologies can operate in lots of different ways, and there certainly are ways for these technologies to like generate text that sounds more quote unquote personable, right? Or quote unquote friendlier. And I'm putting that in quotation marks because it's just text, right? And it's a corporation behind that text typically right now. That too is persuasive. That too is rhetoric, right? Like it's creating that so that you interact with it in a given way. You know, and I think it's possible Alex would feel differently about this because I acknowledge that it's probably the case that on like a individual basis, like people sometimes do engage with like these quote unquote therapist products or these quote unquote companion products and feel some sense of like companionship or support, right? So I want to acknowledge that like that's a real feeling that the person is having. But I also want to note that I would also describe that as an illusion, you know, and I would say that the fact that it is an illusion is meaningful, because if it's the case that like we use these things and we feel that feeling that we have when we're talking to somebody who really understands us, I think it's because an illusion is being created that like there is a person and like that's the meaningful part. But the fact is there isn't a person. It's like Oz behind a screen, right? And so if we acknowledge that there isn't a person, like to me it feels like the thing we think the tool is providing breaks down, right? Like it's just a kind of a dumb magic trick, but a magic trick where it's not just like a cute magician on the street, but it's big technology companies that are the most powerful entities in our society.
Yeah. All right, with that.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Can we give one more hand for Vauhini Vara? This is thoroughly enjoyable, and I'm so glad to have you both here. And I just really enjoyed this conversation, and I appreciate your time and talent. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having us here.
Of course. Thank you. Thank you appreciate you too. I do think now that we've been dubbed the collective Samwise, we can go.
And you have to buy the book now. Come on.
We can go out into the world and act as such. We have books at the front register. You can find them there. You can also pre-order Alex's book there if you choose. I would encourage you to do so.
Wait, let me just say, I've read that book.
Yeah.
I've read that book. And for for those of you who are really interested in understanding in a very clear way, like, what are the critiques of AI across all these different sectors of society? And you just want like a handbook, and you're interested in the argument that this is all actually a big con and a big lie. Read this book. It'll be of interest to you.
Heck
It's
of an
also very
endorsement.
funny.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Vauhini will be signing right here, so you can find books at the front and then come on back here to have them signed. Please take a look around, make yourself comfortable. Let me know if you have any other questions, and if not, we will see you next time. Thank you so much.